So first, we have tools of fiscal policy, and this is broken down into 5 different tools, the first of which is the budget. There are 3 types of budget, the annual balanced budget, the cyclically balanced budget, and the compensatory budget. Then there's taxation, which is used to balance the economy and serves multiple different functions. So increased disposable income promotes consumption and investment as a result of lower tax rates. An anti-inflationary tax policy works to reduce consumer demand and excessive spending. Then we have public expenditures, which is increased government involvement, which expands public spending. So there are several effects such as income, economic output, and employment. And then we have public works, which includes expenditures for public use such as roads, railways, schools, etc. And then there's public debt, which fights against inflation and deflation, which brings economic stability and high employment. And then we have tools of monetary policy, which is broken down into 4 different tools. So first we have the reserve requirement, which is the money a bank must keep on hand. It's held in reserve vaults or at a central bank. So lower reserve rates means increased amount of money loaned, and higher reserve rates are contractionary. And then we have open market operations, which means the central bank buys and sells bonds or securities. And a bank buys bonds when it wants expansionary monetary policy, and it sells bonds when it wants contractionary monetary policy. And then there is the discount rate, which is the interest rate charged to central banks on loans from the Fed. And the discount window, which is part of the discount rate, refers to this process of federal lending. There's a stigma of bank failure attached to getting a discount window. And then finally, there is interest rates for excessive reserves, and that is when the Fed pays interest on any excess reserves held by banks. So a decreased rate means increased lending, and an increased rate means opposite, decreased lending. And that was created in response to the 2008 financial crisis.
What happened in the Great Depression and why? The Great Depression is the worst economic downturn in American history and arguably within the industrial era history, lasting from 1929 until 1939. The Great Depression was caused by the stock market crash of October 1929, where shareholders began selling their stock rapidly. Because of the Depression, factories and businesses had to slow production and began laying off workers by the thousands. Those who were lucky enough to keep their jobs had their wages plummeted. Homelessness across the country also skyrocketed. The gold standard caused global economics to drop as well because of how much of an economic magnate America was at the time. Herbert Hoover, who was the president at the time, did not want the government to interfere with the economy as he felt it was not right. He wanted the economy to be its own entity from the federal government so that the people and the government were not on the same money. However, in the next election, Franklin Roosevelt was unanimously elected by the country. Franklin Roosevelt set up the New Deal, and he established a 4-day bank holiday almost immediately into his presidency. Within the New Deal began various 3-letter programs and organizations. Over time, these organizations helped, whether either locally or nationally, to slowly rebuild the economy. However, they also put thousands of dollars of debt into the U.S. Treasury.
Question 4. What was the Great Recession? The Great Recession was a global economic crisis that lasted from 2007 to 2009. Some causes were that there was a housing boom from the early 2000s to early 2007. This caused housing prices to rise to an unreasonable level. Due to the price increase, many loans were granted to people with poor credit histories. These loans were called high-risk loans. By September of 2007, housing prices had decreased because the demand for homes decreased. This caused the price of loans to drastically increase and ultimately led to many foreclosures. The results of the Great Recession include that banks weren't able to pay back the money they had lost from loans that were taken out, the stock market crashed, increased mortgage foreclosures, unemployment rate rose to a high percentage, and lots of money was lost.
So questions 5 and 6 kind of go hand in hand.
Number 5 asks, what does classical economic theory have to say about how economic stability is achieved? And number 6 asks the same, but about Keynesian economic theory. As for classic economic theory, it emphasizes the fact that free markets lead to an efficient outcome. It is self-regulated and assumes that the long-run aggregate supply curve is inelastic. Therefore, there's no deviation from full intervention and strives to keep markets free of potential barriers to their efficient operation. And Keynesian economic theory argues that the economy can be below full capacity for a considerable amount of time due to imperfect markets, and also places a greater role for expansionary fiscal policy to overcome recession.
Unlike classical economic theory, Keynesian economic theory focuses on the idea that the economy won't just fix itself, but that it needs help and regulation from local, state, and federal governments. According to thebalance.com, the goal of the Green New Deal is to battle climate change, changing the U.S. to 100% renewable energy by 2030, 9 years from now. This idea would lead to increased spending from the federal government and would be extremely difficult to regulate and force the entire American population to switch to electric vehicles, etc. The deal has nothing to do with solving our country's debt crisis. In fact, it would only make it worse. According to ThoughtCo.com, the Balanced Budget Amendment keeps the federal and state governments from spending more money than what they make through taxes unless otherwise authorized by a 2/3 vote in Congress. It requires that the government come up with a budget every year. Regulating the amount of money that can be spent to only what they have would greatly help to solve the debt crisis.